right across from the drugstore on 63rd Street in Englewood.
Initially, his wife Myrta's name was on the deed, but soon it was altered to say it belonged to Myrta's mother, Lucy Belknap. Holmes wanted his name on as few official documents as possible. That way, when he inevitably faced consequences for his actions, he could point the finger elsewhere.
With the money he got from working at the drugstore and his numerous petty scams, Holmes set about developing the land on 63rd Street in early 1887. He first had architects draw up plans for a two-story building. The first floor would house retail establishments, including his drugstore, which he planned to move into the new building once it was complete.
The second floor was to be filled with apartments. Outwardly, Holmes declared he intended on becoming a landlord and real estate mogul, but even the first blueprints included some unusual features.
Accessible from the rear of the new drugstore, Holmes placed a small, secret room between the first and second floors. He also installed a hidden staircase. Oddly, the entrance to the staircase was found behind a trap door in the bathroom on the second floor.
Years later, a third floor was added, and Holmes' darkest motivations revealed themselves. Eventually, the building was known as the Murder Castle, one of the most notorious buildings in the history of Chicago.
Up next, H.H. Holmes makes the castle his base of operations and commits his first murder. Now, back to the story.
By the end of 1887, 27-year-old Dr. H.H. Holmes had started construction on a large retail and apartment building. He planned to run a pharmacy on the first floor and rent out apartments on the second.
He raised the money for the venture through a variety of cons and shameless fraud, a practice he continued while the complex was under construction. For example, he once bought an enormous safe on credit and had it installed in the new drugstore.
After moving the safe to the new building site, he proceeded with construction, essentially building a room around the safe. When Holmes refused to pay what he owed on the vault, the company came to repossess it.
Holmes was only too happy to oblige. He said the company was free to take the safe, but he promised to sue if they damaged the building while removing it.
After appraising the situation, the safe company found it couldn't possibly get the vault out without knocking down some walls. They were forced to leave it where it stood.
Similar situations occurred with the architects and contractors. Holmes flat out refused to pay his bills. At least 60 lawsuits were filed against him over 8 years in Chicago. Each time he was sued, he claimed his mother-in-law Lucy was the one liable for the debts, as he had put her name on the deed to the land instead of his own.
Even when the suits were ruled in favor of the contractors, there wasn't much creditors could do. Holmes didn't legally own any property and often sold off the things he borrowed or rented, so there wasn't anything left to repossess either.
Thanks to his many connivances, 27-year-old Holmes finished the building toward the end of 1887. By that time, he had relocated his drugstore from across the street to the first floor of his new complex.
Holmes' latest batch of employees soon found that their boss had some quirks. His housekeeper claimed he would regularly tell her he was going out of town, only to show up skulking around the building at night. Each time, he had some excuse as to why his trip had fallen through, but they never seemed well thought out or particularly believable.
The drugstore employees were also aware of the hidden staircase and compartment between the first and second floor. Oddly, none of them seemed particularly unnerved by the building's strange design. Some employees took breaks or even naps in the small secret compartment. In their minds, there were far more suspicious things going on.
Holmes reportedly once asked an employee to get inside the large safe in the store. He locked the safe behind them and then asked them to scream. After verifying the vault was almost soundproof, Holmes opened the door again. Naturally, he never revealed to the employee why he had asked them to scream from inside the safe. He could have been planning to use the safe as part of a con, or it could have been a component of something more sinister.
Holmes' ultimate goals were
I
always
guess
hard to pin down.
I guess I have
The
some
custodian at
spoilers
the
here
store
on
once
for you
said
guys
Holmes
who
owned a
my
collection of
movie.
false mustaches and disguises.
I guess I'll show you
Sometimes,
guys.
seemingly for no
Really
reason,
fast, so
Holmes would
annoying.
emerge from his office dressed as a stereotypical Southern gentleman, complete with a fake beard and bushy eyebrows.
Of
Bushy
course,
eyebrows,
hijinks
wow.
like these were nothing compared to most of his predatory cons. He never seemed to be content with honest work, and instead constantly involved himself in bolder and more ridiculous cons.
As long as he felt he could get away with it, Holmes was willing to steal, abuse, and even murder to get what he wanted. For the next couple of years, Holmes continued to borrow and steal as much as he could. In the process, he put his mother-in-law, Lucy Belknap, and his second wife, Myrta, through an incredible amount of stress, as lawsuit after lawsuit implicated them as well as Holmes.
Throughout it all, however, Myrta stuck by her husband. In 1889, when Holmes was 29 years old and she was 28, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Lucy after Myrta's mother.
Not long after Lucy was born, Holmes began cheating on Myrta with one of his employees. Julia Connor was the wife of a jeweler Holmes had hired for his drugstore. While Ned Connor oversaw the jewelry department, his wife worked as a cashier. They lived on the second floor of Holmes' complex, along with their young daughter, Pearl.
Holmes saw an opportunity to make a move on Julia soon after she and her husband moved in. Holmes could hear the Connors fighting at night through the thin walls of the building.
Away from the prying eyes of her husband, Holmes became very attentive to Julia. They carried on an affair for over a year, and in early 1890, Ned and Julia separated.
At that point, Ned quit his job at the store and started living elsewhere in the city. Almost as soon as Ned moved on, Holmes sought him out and subtly bragged that he was sleeping with Julia.
As Ned later put it, he told me something no man on earth could have known if he had not been intimate with her.
Apparently, tormenting Ned had been a part of the fun all along. The desire to boast about his infidelity may have been the same thing that drove Holmes to run cons. He loved humiliating others. According to Dr. Neil Burton, humiliation is one of the most affecting feelings we experience. Some may even prefer death to severe public humiliation. Burton wrote, "Humiliation involves abasement of honor and dignity, and with that, loss of status and standing. When we're humiliated, we may also internalize the trauma, leading to fear and anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares, sleeplessness, suspicion and paranoia, social isolation, apathy, depression, and suicidal ideation."
Perhaps this seed was planted in Holmes when he was humiliated as a boy, tormented by the skeleton prank. In response, he decided to inflict this anguish on others, even those closest to him. His favorite scams were ones where he could watch the look on his victims' faces as they realized they'd been hoodwinked. He wanted them to know they'd been beaten, and that there was nothing they could do about it.
His actions fit with a kind of behavior that political science professor Edward Weisband described as excessive cruelty. He wrote that for some, the appeal of violating moral taboos is found in the obscenity of the crimes. He noted that for these people, it's not enough simply to cross the line. The further they transgress, and the more unnecessary the brutality, the more enjoyment they get from their evil acts.
Ending Ned and Julia's marriage wasn't enough for Holmes. He also used Julia as an unwitting party to several of his scams.
He collected almost $2,000 from her at one point in exchange for making her a part owner of the drugstore. The position granted her no rights or profits, but Holmes gladly took her money anyway.
He also signed her name to a variety of small companies he falsely created as well, mostly to misdirect any legal consequences of his actions onto someone else. In due course, Julia was named in several lawsuits directed at fake businesses Holmes was involved in. Just like with Myrta and her mother, Holmes saw his relationship with Julia as just another way to take advantage of her.
Even so, Julia and Holmes continued their affair until the end of 1891, and 30-year-old Holmes remained as devious as ever. He successfully kept their liaison secret from his wife, even as he got Julia into legal trouble.
But everything Holmes had put Julia through so far was nothing compared to what was coming. Just before Christmas of 1891, Julia got an invitation in the mail. Her sister was getting married back in Davenport, Iowa. Thrilled by the news, she hurried to prepare for a trip to attend the wedding.
On Christmas Eve, she and her daughter, Pearl, now 6, spent the evening with the Crows, another family who boarded at Holmes' building. John Crow later recalled that Julia talked excitedly about her sister's wedding.
She was looking forward to the trip, but told John she intended to pack light for the journey. She said she would only be gone for a week or two, and wasn't planning to leave until after Christmas.
As Mrs. Crow later said, Julia talked of what she would do Christmas Day, saying nothing to cause us to think she intended on going away that night. She even left the dinner dishes on the table.
And yet, after she left the Crow's apartment, no one ever saw Julia or Pearl again.
What exactly happened to them is unknown. In later years, Holmes sometimes claimed he'd never killed Julia at all, while other times he said she'd died accidentally.
Holmes' lawyer, D.T. Duncombe, told a newspaper that Holmes had privately confessed to murdering Julia, but he was never clear about how or why Holmes had done it.
The most likely theory is based on the explanation Holmes gave in later years, that he got Julia pregnant with his child and convinced her to have an abortion. Then the procedure went awry.
Though Holmes was technically a doctor, he didn't have much practical experience with surgical procedures. At the time, abortion was illegal, and even when performed by experienced physicians, it often resulted in the death of the mother.
As to what happened to 6-year-old Pearl, there's no way to tell. If her mother did die during the operation, it seems like Holmes could have given Pearl to her father, Ned, without much trouble. But when he claimed Julia had accidentally died during surgery, he had no explanation for the little girl's disappearance. But we know he was responsible for her death.
Her body laid in the cellar for years, until the bones of a young child were found after Holmes' capture.
On Christmas Day, the Crow family, who had spent Christmas Eve with Julia and Pearl, went out to visit friends. When they came home that night, they found Julia and Pearl's apartment had been boarded up. They found the whole thing strange, but assumed at first Julia had simply left for Davenport early.
Holmes acted as if Julia and Pearl were alive, and even pretended to look for them. He also kept in contact with Ned, likely motivated by some twisted sense of amusement he got from stringing the man along.
But though Holmes was committed to outwardly feigning concern for Julia and Pearl's disappearances, he wasn't going to leave money sitting on the table. And soon he rented their abandoned apartment to a new family.
As the new renter, Mrs. Doyle, later reported, when Holmes took us in to look at it, it presented a remarkable appearance. In the dining room, the table was standing untouched after a meal. On the floor and chairs was the clothing of Mrs. Connor and her child. A doll was laying on the floor, and Holmes quickly shoved it under the bed with his foot.
Holmes even tried to sell Mrs. Doyle the leftover clothes still sitting in Julia's dresser. When she politely refused, he had them sent somewhere else.
Despite some suspicions from fellow tenants about the strangeness of Julia and Pearl's disappearance, no one had a concrete reason to suspect Holmes. After a few months, he breathed a sigh of relief.
Ned assumed Julia had run away to cut him off from his daughter, and everyone else assumed something had happened to them on their trip to Davenport. Just like he always did, it seemed Holmes had gotten away clean, and unfortunately, Julia and Pearl were only the first of many victims to come.
As Holmes later wrote, "Yes, I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to song, nor the ambition of an intellectual man to be great."
The devil truly was inside Holmes, and it was just beginning to emerge.
Find your grilling groove with a Weber Genesis Smart Gas Grill. Discover what's possible.
Thanks again for tuning in to Serial Killers. We'll be back Monday with Part 2, exploring Holmes' horrific murder spree and the completion of his sadistic murder castle.
For more information on H.H. Holmes, amongst the many sources we used, we found the book H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil by Adam Seltzer, extremely helpful to our research.
You can find more episodes of Serial Killers and all other Parcast originals for free on Spotify. Not only does Spotify already have all of your favorite music, but now Spotify's making it easy for you to enjoy all of your favorite Parcast originals, like Serial Killers, for free from your.
Due to the graphic nature of this killer's crimes, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes dramatizations and discussions of murder and assault that some people may find offensive. We advise extreme caution for children under 13. Childhood is filled with stories. Some are funny, some are fantastical, and some, well, some are frightening. As children, we all hear scary stories about a variety of monsters, but there is one that kids have been warned about for generations: the boogeyman. The boogeyman is a monster that preys on children, takes them away, and gobbles them up. Learning about the boogeyman is often a child's introduction to the idea of fear itself. It's a warning about the unknown threats that lurk in the world around them. As we grow up, we learn that the boogeyman is a work of fiction. It was just a scary story. But what if I told you, once upon a time, there was a real-life boogeyman, one that preyed on children, took them away, and gobbled them up?